6 years ago, everything in her world looked picture perfect from the outside. She lived in a peaceful suburb with Daniel, her husband of 4 years. He was gentle, soft-spoken, and unfailingly loyal. People admired their marriage, calling them stable, mature, even ideal. But beneath that calm exterior, a slow unraveling had begun. She didn't realize how much the silence in their marriage had begun to suffocate her. Daniel wasn't cruel. He never yelled, never ignored her, never cheated. But his presence began to feel like absence. He came home late, ate dinner quietly, asked about her day in passing, and retreated into his routine. There were no fights, but there was no fire either. The love was still there, she believed, but buried under layers of unspoken loneliness. That's when Sarah re-entered her life. An old college friend, vibrant, wild, and full of messy stories. Sarah introduced her to Michael, a charming, confident man with an easy smile and a way of looking at her like she mattered. At first, they were all just friends. Michael made her laugh again. He noticed the little things. He asked about her art, her dreams, things Daniel hadn't asked in years. She didn't plan for anything to happen, but emotions don't always ask for permission. One night, after a small get-together with wine and music, Michael and she ended up alone on the balcony. He asked if she was happy. She hesitated for too long. That silence turned into a kiss, and that kiss became the first crack in the life she had built. For 2 weeks, she lived a secret life, lying to herself more than anyone. She told herself it was a wake-up call, a spark, a mistake she didn't stop. But Daniel knew. She didn't know how. Maybe he saw the texts. Maybe it was her behavior. Or maybe he just knew her well enough to recognize a shift. One evening, she came home and found him sitting at the table, eyes blank, a packed bag by his side. He didn't ask questions. He didn't raise his voice. He only said, "You don't need to explain, just take care." Then he left. No note, no fight, just absence. She stood in the kitchen as the front door clicked shut, and something inside her collapsed. She tried calling Michael that night, desperate for comfort, but he didn't pick up. 2 days later, he stopped replying altogether. Whatever she thought they had was gone. She stared at the silence of her house, at the empty side of the bed, at the echoes of Daniel's quiet loyalty, and for the first time, truly understood what she had lost. In the weeks after Daniel left, everything unraveled faster than she ever could have imagined. Michael, the man she had risked everything for, vanished almost immediately. He stopped returning her messages, dodged her calls, and when she finally showed up at his apartment, a neighbor told her he'd moved out. No goodbye, no explanation. He disappeared like a shadow, leaving her to sit with the wreckage alone. Her world shrank. Friends who once filled her weekends stopped inviting her. Some unfollowed her quietly. Others were more direct, telling her they couldn't support what she'd done. Even Sarah, who had introduced her to Michael, distanced herself. Her parents didn't yell or shame her. They were polite, too polite, the kind that's worse than anger. Conversations became shorter. Phone calls turned to texts. Texts turned to silence. She tried reaching out to Daniel more times than she could count. Emails, messages, even handwritten letters. But everything bounced back. His social media was gone. His number was changed. He had vanished with the kind of finality that left no doors open. And though she had no right to expect anything different, the silence gutted her. She sank into herself. Her apartment became both a prison and a mirror. She stopped painting, stopped laughing. Days blurred into nights. She tried dating again eventually, hoping distraction might dull the ache, but no one stayed, and she didn't let them get close enough to want to. Every man she met felt like a stranger compared to the quiet man who used to fold her laundry without being asked. Therapy became a necessity, not a choice. Her therapist asked, gently but relentlessly, what she had been looking for when she betrayed her marriage. At first, she said she didn't know, that it just happened. But weeks turned into months, and finally, the truth surfaced like a wound breaking open. She didn't cheat because she was in love with Michael. She cheated because she didn't know how to say, "I feel invisible," because silence had become her marriage's native language, and hers too. Years passed, 3, then 4. She changed jobs, moved cities, tried to rewrite her story. But the past never stayed buried. Every year, on their anniversary, she'd find herself checking the date, wondering where Daniel was. Every birthday, she imagined if he celebrated alone or with someone new. She searched his name online more times than she'd ever admit. But he remained unfindable. No social trace, no digital footprint. It was like he dissolved into the world, untouchable. Regret became her silent roommate, living in the space beside her toothbrush, her dinner table, her reflection. It wasn't loud, it didn't cry, but it never left. And in the quietest moments, when no one was watching, she still whispered his name into the dark, not expecting a reply, just hoping the universe still remembered the man she once loved and the woman she wished she'd been. It was the kind of afternoon that made everything feel slower, softer, grey clouds pressing against the windows, rain tapping like fingers on glass. She'd stopped into the bookstore cafe just to escape the drizzle, planning to sip her tea and lose herself in a paperback. Her coat hung damp over the back of the chair, the air smelling faintly of old pages and espresso. She hadn't expected anything extraordinary. Just another quiet day in a long string of quiet days. She looked up from her book to take a sip, then froze. Across the room, by the poetry shelf, stood Daniel. Time collapsed, the world narrowed. It had been 6 years, and yet she knew him instantly. He looked different, but also exactly the same. His hair was shorter, flecked with grey at the temples. A neat beard softened the lines of his face. He wore a dark sweater and carried an umbrella, drops of rain still glistening on his shoulders. There was a stillness about him, composed, rooted, almost peaceful. Their eyes met. He stopped mid-step. His gaze didn't hold anger or surprise. Just stillness, recognition. After a second that felt like an hour, he gave the smallest nod and turned as if to walk away. She stood abruptly. "Daniel." He paused, turned halfway, unsure. She stepped forward, her voice quieter. "Please." For a moment, he looked like he might keep going. But then he walked back, pulled out the chair across from her, and sat. His hands folded neatly on the table. She didn't know what to say. I didn't expect to see you." "Me neither," he said simply. His voice was deeper than she remembered, calmer, weighted. They talked. Small things. Weather. Work. The book she was reading. The city. Each word was careful, like walking on thin ice. Both of them afraid to fall through. Then she saw it. The ring. A simple silver band on his left hand. Her stomach tightened. She smiled anyway, the corners of her mouth practiced, polite. "You look happy," she said. He looked down at the table, then up at her. "I am. Happier than I've ever been, actually." She nodded, her throat dry. "That's really good. I'm glad." And she meant it. But inside, something broke loose. 1,000 unsaid things pushed against her ribs. Regret, relief, jealousy, gratitude, shame. He glanced at his watch. "I should get going." As he stood, something in her chest panicked. She didn't want it to end this way, not with pleasantries, not like strangers. She looked up at him and asked quietly, "Do you hate me?" He froze, looked down at her, not unkindly, not coldly, just honest. "No," he said after a moment. "I used to, but hate only keeps the wound open." And with that, he walked away. She watched him disappear into the grey blur of rain outside the window, and though she didn't know where he was going or who was waiting for him, she knew finally that he was no longer hers to wonder about. The rain had stopped by the time she got home, but the dampness had settled inside her chest, a quiet ache she couldn't shake. She stood in her apartment, coat still on, staring at nothing. The image of him, Daniel, older and calmer, with eyes that no longer carried rage, kept looping in her mind. Not the words they exchanged, but the silence between them. The look, the ring, the way he said, "Happier than I've ever been." She sat by the window for hours, watching the dark swallow the city, thinking of the woman who now shared his last name. What was she like? Kind? Patient? The sort of woman who never let things go unsaid? Did Daniel smile more with her than he ever had with her? That question wouldn't leave. It rose again and again, dragging her back through the years. She remembered the way he used to make her tea when she had migraines, gently placing the mug on the nightstand without speaking. She remembered how he danced with her in the kitchen, socks sliding on the floor, dinner burning in the background. She remembered the day he proposed, on a hiking trail, breathless, not from the climb, but from the weight of the moment. And she remembered how she said yes without hesitation. That man had loved her. She was sure of it. And she had loved him too. But somewhere along the way, silence had filled the space between them, louder than any scream. That night, she opened her laptop and began typing. A letter to Daniel. It wasn't polished. It wasn't careful. It was messy and raw. She poured it all out. The regret, the apology, the questions, the truth she hadn't known how to speak back then. She wrote about the woman she used to be and the woman she had become. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't ask for anything. She just wrote. Then she sat staring at it. For hours. She didn't send it. Instead, the next morning, she composed a new message. Short, quiet, and true. "Thank you. Seeing you reminded me that not all stories end in bitterness." She pressed send before she could overthink it. 2 days passed. Then, a reply. "Some stories don't end. They just take a different shape." She read it 3 times. Each time, something softened inside her. It wasn't closure. It was something better. A door. Not to the past, but to peace. It was a crisp afternoon when they met again, this time by his suggestion. He had messaged her 2 nights after their brief exchange, asking if she'd like to take a walk. "There's a park near the lake," he had written. "Feels like a place where things don't need to be rushed." She arrived early, nerves tightening in her chest. The trees were shedding their last golden leaves. Children played in the distance. The air smelled of damp earth and beginnings. She saw him approaching slowly, hands in his coat pockets. There was no tension in his posture, no hesitation, just quiet purpose. They began walking without much small talk, their footsteps sinking on the gravel path. A long silence settled between them, not heavy, just full. Finally, she spoke. "I never said I was sorry the right way," she began. "Not once. I hurt you. I ruined something good. And I've carried that every day." He didn't interrupt. She continued, her voice cracking only slightly. "I'm not here to make it right. I know I can't. But I need you to know. I take full responsibility for everything, for betraying your trust, for not speaking when I should have, for failing you." They stopped walking. He turned toward her, his eyes gentler than she expected. "You didn't fail me alone," he said quietly. She blinked, unsure. He took a deep breath and said words she never imagined hearing. "I didn't leave just because of the affair. I left because I realized I had stopped showing up for you long before that." Her breath caught. He went on. "I was burned out. At work. In life. I was spiraling into something I didn't even have the language for. I thought I was just tired all the time. But now I know it was depression. And I didn't want to admit it. I just shut down. I stopped laughing. I stopped listening. I thought being quiet was the same as being peaceful." She stared at him, stunned. "I wasn't there," he said. "Not really. And I think a part of me already knew I was losing you. I just didn't know how to fight for you. So I didn't." A breeze passed through the trees, scattering leaves at their feet. "I'm not saying what you did didn't hurt," he added. "It broke me. But now I understand more than I did back then. And maybe that's the part that makes it bearable." Her throat tightened. She tried to speak, but nothing came out at first. "I thought you just vanished because you hated me," she finally whispered. He shook his head. "I vanished because I didn't know who I was anymore. I didn't know how to be a man who could stay after something like that. And I didn't think I deserved to be fought for either." She wiped at her eyes tears she hadn't meant to cry. They stood like that for a while, letting the honesty settle around them. No more pretending, no more old roles. Just two people who had once loved deeply and who had both broken in their own ways. And in that moment, it didn't feel like forgiveness or blame. It felt like truth. She never expected to be invited into Daniel's new life, let alone his home. When he asked if she'd like to stop by one weekend to meet his family, she hesitated. It felt surreal, like walking into a version of a future that had once been hers, now belonging to someone else. But there was no bitterness in his tone, only openness. So she said yeah. His house sat at the edge of a quiet neighborhood, the kind with front porches, bicycles on lawns, and welcome mats that meant it. She paused before ringing the doorbell, her heart thudding like it was her first time meeting his parents, not his wife. Alina opened the door. She was everything she wasn't expecting. Warm, elegant, effortlessly kind. Her smile wasn't guarded. It was real. "You must be Lily," she said gently. "Come in, we've been waiting." Inside, the house was light and alive. Children's drawings on the fridge, toys in the corner, soft music playing in the background. It smelled like cinnamon and home. Then the little girl came running out from the hallway. 3 years old, curly-haired, wearing a pink tutu over her jeans. She hid behind Alina's leg at first, then peeked out curiously. "Sweetheart, this is Miss Lily," Alina said, touching her shoulder gently. The child looked up, wide-eyed, then gave a shy wave. "Hi, Miss Lily." Her heart clenched. She managed a smile and waved back. "Hi there." Daniel entered the room carrying mugs of tea. He looked completely in his element, comfortable, grounded, at peace. They all sat in the living room, and for a while, the conversation was light. Alina asked about her work, her art. The little girl brought her a stuffed animal and climbed onto her father's lap. But then, when the moment was right, Daniel spoke quietly. "We're happy," he said, looking at her. "But that doesn't mean I forgot you. You're part of who I became." She felt something shift inside her, a strange blend of sadness and peace. She nodded. "And you're part of who I became too." It wasn't awkward. It wasn't strange. It felt right. Like a chapter closing not with grief, but with grace. As she stood to leave, the little girl clung to her father's leg, and Alina walked her to the door. Just before she stepped outside, Alina embraced her, softly, sincerely. "Thank you," she whispered in her ear, "for letting go." And for the first time in years, Lily felt like she had. It happened on a Thursday evening, months after her visit to Daniel's home. She had been invited to a local charity fundraiser, art auction, wine, soft jazz playing in the corner. The kind of event where people wore polished smiles and talked about causes between sips of Pinot Noir. She was browsing a set of small paintings when she heard his voice. Michael. She turned instinctively. He stood across the room, engaged in half-hearted conversation, holding a drink. He looked older now, hair thinning, posture less confident than she remembered. When he saw her, his expression flickered. For a brief second, panic, then forced indifference. She didn't want to speak, but something pulled her forward. Closure, maybe, or the final thread of curiosity that hadn't quite snapped. "Michael," she said, calm but clear. He turned fully, eyes darting for a moment like he was calculating an escape. "Lily," he said flatly. "Wow, it's been years." She gave a small nod. "Yeah, years." He glanced down at his glass. "You look good. How have you been?" "I'm fine," she said. "You?" He shrugged, avoiding her eyes. "Busy, work, life, you know." There was a silence. She didn't plan the question, it just came out. "Do you ever think about it? What happened back then?" Michael shifted uncomfortably, looked around as if checking who might be listening. Then he gave a quick, careless shrug. "We were stupid. I thought I loved you. I was wrong." That was it. No apology, no remorse, not even a hint of depth. She waited a moment, thinking maybe more was coming, but there was nothing. Just a man who had played with fire and walked away without a single burn. And in that instant, something clicked. All those years, she had carried shame, regret, guilt. She had torn herself apart, trying to understand how she had fallen into that moment with him. She had blamed Daniel for being distant, blamed herself for being weak. But she had never truly faced what Michael was. He hadn't loved her. He had used her loneliness to feed his own ego. And the moment it got messy, he disappeared, leaving her to deal with the wreckage alone. She took a breath, straightened her shoulders. "Thank you," she said quietly. He blinked. For what? For making it so easy to let go. Then she turned and walked away without another word. And for the first time since that chapter began, it felt like it had truly ended. The night was quiet, the kind of stillness that wrapped around her like a heavy blanket. No music played, no distractions, just the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of tires on wet pavement outside. She sat at her desk, an untouched cup of tea beside her, fingers hovering above the keyboard. For days, the words had been circling her, asking to be released. Not just the story, but the truth. The truth beneath the story. Not about the affair, not about the fallout, but about the woman she had been before any of it began. The woman who had forgotten how to speak her needs, her ache, her emptiness. The woman who had smiled while quietly unraveling. So she started to write. At first, the sentences were clumsy, protective. She tiptoed around the pain, but as the night deepened, her words sharpened, cleared. She wrote about love, how soft it can begin, and how silent it can die. She wrote about betrayal, not just what she had done to Daniel, but what she had done to herself by never asking to be seen. She wrote about shame, about the sound of a front door closing and never reopening, about a man who walked away without yelling, and in doing so, taught her what dignity looked like, about healing, slow, stubborn, unfinished. And in the middle of it all, she paused, typed a sentence. The worst thing I ever did wasn't cheating. It was silencing myself before that. She stared at it, fingers trembling. Then, without changing a single word, she kept going. By dawn, it was done. She didn't sign her name. She didn't want credit. She wanted release. So she posted it anonymously on a personal essay site, titled simply, "The Silence Before the Storm." Then she closed her laptop and went to bed. By the time she woke, her phone was buzzing. Notifications, emails. A friend, who didn't know it was her, had even sent her the link, saying, "You need to read this. It broke me." Thousands had read it. The comments poured in. Some were angry. "You don't deserve forgiveness." Others were kind. "Thank you for writing what I've never been brave enough to say." And some were raw. "This is my story too." She read them all. Each one, even the harsh ones. She didn't flinch, because for the first time in years, she felt seen, not as a villain or a victim, but as a full human being. Flawed, changed, still standing. And somehow, through a screen full of strangers' words, she felt less alone than she had in 6 years. The trees looked the same, but she didn't. The park had barely changed. Still the same winding path, the same weathered bench beneath the tall oak tree, the same lake shimmering just beyond the hill. But the woman who sat there now carried herself differently. Her shoulders weren't weighed down by regret. Her hands didn't tremble with what-ifs. She simply sat. It had been months since she'd seen Daniel, since she met Alina and their daughter, since she'd finally faced Michael, and since she had spilled her story into the world for strangers to see. But today, she wasn't here because of any of them. She was here for herself. The autumn breeze brushed against her face. She closed her eyes for a moment and let it pass through her, like a breath long held and finally exhaled. The bench creaked softly beneath her, but the silence didn't feel empty. It felt earned. She looked across the lake and thought of the past, but it didn't sting the way it used to. There was no longing anymore. No fantasy about rewriting the script, just clarity. They had met too young, she thought, loved too quietly, hurt too deeply, but somehow they both grew. He found peace, she found her voice, and neither of them were the same people who stood in that kitchen 6 years ago when the world broke open. She smiled softly to herself. For the first time, the story felt whole, even in its messiness. Especially in its messiness. A figure approached from the trail. A man, alone, maybe in his 30s, paused and gestured to the other end of the bench. "Mind if I sit?" She glanced over. "Go ahead." He sat, pulling out a small notebook, jotting something with a pencil. They sat in silence for a few minutes before he spoke again. "Nice place to think, isn't it?" She looked out at the water. "The best." He smiled. "I come here when I'm stuck. Words come easier here." She turned to him, her curiosity light but genuine. "Writer?" He nodded, trying to be. They laughed, quietly, the kind of laughter that comes easy between strangers with nothing to prove. She didn't know his name. She didn't need to. In that moment, everything felt open again, not like starting over, but starting forward, and somewhere, deep inside, she knew. She wasn't waiting for a second chance. She was finally ready for a real one. Voiceover, final line. Some stories don't need a perfect ending. They just need the courage to begin again.